Chapter 6. The Mind-Body Problem. Learning Objectives. 6.1 Explain the philosophical questions surrounding the mind-body relationship. 6.2 Define 3 possible solutions to the mind-body problem. 6.3 Analyze the arguments for and against substance dualism. 6.4 Explain the philosophical position of physicalism. 6.5 Summarize the objections to behaviorism. 6.6 Describe the strengths and weaknesses of the identity theory. 6.7 Explain the advantages and limitations of functionalism. 6.8 Explain the key ideas behind eliminative materialism. 6.9 Summarize the arguments of the various theories of the mind. What is the problem? 6.1 Explain the philosophical questions surrounding the mind-body relationship. The problem of personal identity has introduced us to the idea that our selves have a physical as well as a psychic component. In this chapter, we will explore the relationship between our bodies and our minds in more detail. Initially, you might be surprised to hear that philosophers find the relationship between body and mind problematic. Humans like you and me have a body, and we also have a mind. What is so mysterious about this? At first glance, very little, but certain questions begin to emerge as soon as we describe the features of bodies and minds in more detail. Let us start by describing some characteristics of human bodies, using my own body as an example. My body is 5'7" tall and weighs 160 pounds. It has brown hair and blue eyes. My body's nose is rather crooked since I broke it several times in my youth, and my feet are rather man. It is not particularly challenging to describe bodies, which have physical properties like any other object. Bodies have color, shape, size, and texture. We can see them with our eyes, measure their weight, and take pictures of them. Moreover, human bodies are subject to the laws of physics. If you take my body and throw it through a second-floor window, it will crash to the ground like a rock. A physicist would be able to calculate the impact velocity without any difficulty, and we would be able to predict that my body would not survive such a fall without damage. Human bodies are similar to complex machines. If we treat them without proper care, they fall apart, and sooner or later, even with proper care, they will stop functioning. Let us now turn to a description of minds. Initially, it might seem as if human minds are more difficult to describe than human bodies. We cannot take pictures of them or measure their size or weight. Notice that if I say, my brain is a grey organic mass that weighs 4 pounds, I have not told you anything about my mind, but rather something about the internal structure of my body. My brain is part of my body, and the fact that my brain is perhaps smaller than yours would not entitle you to conclude that you have a bigger or sharper mind than I have. When we want to describe our minds, we cannot simply give a description of our brains. Although minds cannot be described in the same way that we describe our bodies, there are things we can easily say about our minds. After all, we are aware of the thoughts and sensations that happen within them. Right now, for example, I am thinking that later today I have to buy a present for my mother's birthday. This thought is something that happens in my mind. Having thoughts and beliefs is part of my mental life. But there is more to the mind than that. Another key ingredient of the mind is sensations or feelings. If somebody told me that I am an incompetent teacher of philosophy, I would feel sad and disappointed. These feelings are also part of my mental life. If I merely had a body without a mind, my life would certainly be less cumbersome. There would be no feelings of fear or regret, and I would never be depressed, but life would also be rather dull. Without a mind, there would be no joy or happiness, no dreams or hopes. A steak would have no flavor, and a kiss would have no passion. A good way to approach the mind is to understand it as something that allows us to engage in a wide range of activities, which are shown in the following illustration. We have seen that bodies have physical properties. Minds, on the other hand, can be described in terms of mental states. Memories, sensations, beliefs, and dreams are all examples of mental states. Using one general term to refer to all mental phenomena might suggest that all mental states share common characteristics. However, it is notoriously difficult to find a universal feature that is essential to all mental states. Mental states are diverse and varied, as the following exercise illustrates. Now that we have developed a rough description of human bodies and minds, we can appreciate the emerging puzzle. Human bodies and minds are intimately tied to each other. Physical states, like a cut on my finger, can produce mental states, such as a feeling of pain, and mental states, like feeling embarrassed, can produce physical states, such as blushing. However, in spite of this close interaction, mind and body are quite dissimilar. When we talk about our bodies, we describe them as exhibiting physical properties, which are public in the sense that others can observe and measure what kind of physical state my body is in. A medical doctor, for example, can easily measure a wide range of physical properties of my body, example temperature, weight, size. However, when we talk about our minds, we describe mental states and mental properties and thus talk about beliefs, desires, and wishes. These mental states are experienced from a first-person perspective and are inherently private. Others cannot tell from the outside what it feels like to have my desires or sensations. A medical doctor can tell me that my body is running a fever but cannot tell me what it feels like to have this fever. The experience of having this fever happens in my mind and seems inaccessible to anybody but me. This realization leads us to the central question of the mind-body problem. How exactly are the physical states of human bodies related to the mental states of human minds? Food for thought. In order to come to terms with the role that minds play in this universe, it may be useful to engage in this thought experiment. Imagine, as clearly as you can, a universe that consists only of physical objects and physical properties, but that lacks minds and mental properties. Would this universe contain colors and sounds? Would there be space and time? Would pineapple still taste sweet and the sea salty? Would roses still be beautiful? Make a list of those features of the world that would vanish if all minds were suddenly wiped out. Food for thought. Take a look at the following examples of mental states and try to determine whether they can be grouped into a number of larger categories. 1. Feeling a sharp pain. 2. Being convinced that the Red Sox are going to win the World Series this year. 3. Knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4. 4. Smelling freshly brewed coffee. 5. Seeing a lunar eclipse. 6. Dreaming of winning the lottery. 7. Remember to buy some milk at the grocery store. 8. Imagining a perfect vacation. 9. Fearing that the war on terrorism will never be over. 10. Knowing that there are 9 planets in the solar system. 11. Perceiving a yellow sunflower. 12. Thinking that the earth is round. 13. Experiencing great frustration. Food for thought. Before we discuss several solutions to the mind-body problem in more detail, it may be interesting for you to record your own initial beliefs and ideas about the relationship between mind and body. Answer the following questions with true and false. 1. It is possible for my mind to survive the death of my body. 2. Someday in the future it will be possible to build machines that have a mind just like mine. 3. The best way to treat depression is to change the chemical reactions inside the brain. 4. Sometimes in the future it might be possible for a crazy scientist to create false memories in our mind by simply injecting certain chemicals into my brain. 5. Although scientists can understand the composition and the nature of clouds, planets, black holes, and other physical objects, they will never understand the true nature of emotions like anger, love, or hate. 6. Dogs and cats have beliefs and hopes just like humans do. 7. Sometime in the future computers might have ken and self-awareness. 8. My thoughts and ideas are the product of my environment and my upbringing. 9. Conscious beings who do have beliefs and self-awareness but who do not have brains like ours might exist on other planets. 10. Because it is impossible for machines to be creative or funny, even the most advanced robots could never be stand-up comedians. Possible solutions to the mind-body problem. 6. To define 3 possible solutions to the mind-body problem. Theories about the relationship between physical states and mental states fall into 3 broad categories: physicalism, dualism, and idealism. The basic ideas behind these theories are explained in the adjacent chart. Let us take a closer look at each of these. How are the mental states of my mind and the physical states theories? Supporters of physicalism believe that the physical states of the body are more fundamental than the mental states of the mind. But what exactly does that mean? Let us clarify this idea with the help of an analogy. Consider the relationship between Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain, each of whom has various properties. Huckleberry Finn is a young boy who runs away from home and travels on the Mississippi River. Mark Twain is a well-known American author who was born in Florida, Missouri. It is easy to see that Mark Twain is a more fundamental entity than Huckleberry Finn. If we want to explain why Huckleberry Finn has certain features, we need to appeal to the ideas of Mark Twain. It would be silly to reverse this explanatory relationship. Huckleberry Finn is, after all, a fictional character that would not exist if Mark Twain had never been born. Philosophers use the term ontological dependence to describe the relationship between Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain. In general, we can say that one entity depends ontologically on another entity if the first cannot exist without the second. Physicalists believe that the relationship between body and mind is similar to the relationship between Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn. They believe that we can explain the nature of mental states in terms of the physical states of our bodies. Although there is some controversy among physicalists about exactly how mental states depend on physical states, they all agree that physical states are more fundamental entities than mental states are. Dualism rejects the idea that our minds and mental states are less fundamental than our bodies and physical states. According to dualism, the universe contains 2 different and equally real substances, mind and body. The relationship between these 2 substances is in some ways similar to the relationship between apples and oranges. Just as oranges can exist without apples and apples without oranges, so minds can exist independently of the body. Although many dualists accept the idea that minds and bodies can interact with each other, they maintain that minds are ontologically independent of bodies, and they reject the idea that minds can be explained in terms of the body. Critics of dualism sometimes have dubbed it the doctrine of the ghost within the machine because dualists believe that there is something irreducibly non-physical within conscious beings. Idealism is a third theory that explains how minds and bodies relate to each other. We have already encountered a version of idealism in George Berkeley's defense of an empiricist theory of knowledge. Idealism is the reverse of physicalism, idealism holds that minds are more fundamental than physical bodies. At first encounter, idealism seems outlandish. How can anybody think that the existence of my leg, for example, is ontologically dependent on the thought that I have a leg? We normally think that legs, tables, cars, and other physical objects exist regardless of whether there are minds or not. In the food for thought exercise on page 98, I asked you to imagine what the universe would be like if we were to eliminate all minds from it. An idealist believes that such a universe would be empty since minds rather than matter are the fundamental building blocks of the universe. This is a fascinating idea, but since idealism plays no significant role in the contemporary philosophical debate about the mind-body problem, I will omit a fuller discussion and focus on the debate between dualism and physicalism. Food for thought. In order to understand the term ontological dependence better, answer the following claims with true or false. 1. Tigers are ontologically dependent on lions. 2. Rainbows are ontologically dependent on water and light. 3. Wood is ontologically dependent on trees. 4. Oranges are ontologically dependent on apples. 5. Children are ontologically dependent on their parents. 6. Birds are ontologically dependent on dinosaurs. 7. Heat is ontologically dependent on the velocity of molecules. Substance dualism. 6.3 Analyze the arguments for and against substance dualism. The classical version of dualism is substance dualism, 1596 to 1650. Its most famous proponent was the French philosopher René Descartes, who argued that minds and bodies are different kinds of entities. Bodies are physical substances that are located in space and time and are subject to the laws of physics. Minds, on the other hand, are non-extended thinking substances. Mind substance is much more difficult to describe since it lacks physical properties. However, we can at least describe it negatively as a substance that is not subject to the laws of physics. Arguments for substance dualism. Near-death experiences. Consider this popular, though often neglected, argument in support of substance dualism. 1. If substance dualism is false, then my mind cannot exist independently from my body. 2. My mind can exist independently from my body. Therefore, substance dualism is true. This argument is an instance of the deductive argument form modus tollens and is therefore valid. Let us try to determine whether it is also sound. Premise 1. Seems to be true, but how plausible is premise 2? Many religions support the idea that our minds will survive our bodily deaths and that our minds, on their own or with new spiritual bodies, have the chance to enter heaven. Although this religious conviction can help us to see why the idea of life after death is attractive, it alone cannot deter. Mind whether it is rational to believe that minds can exist separately from bodies. Since philosophers are committed to adopting the most rational beliefs about the universe, we need to go beyond religion to determine whether this belief that our minds can exist without our bodies is reasonable. The best evidence in support of this idea is so-called near-death experiences. Consider what Gloria G. experienced during brain surgery. As I was lying on the table, I heard the doctors pronounce the operation a failure and pronounce me dead. I then remember them frantically trying to resuscitate me. While they were trying to bring me back to life, I was just floating up near the ceiling. It was a weird feeling because I was up there and this body was below. Then I seemed to wander up through the floors of the hospital. I saw plainly, for instance, a young man who had been injured in an automobile accident. Then everything began to get dark. I passed through a spiraling tunnel until I seemed to come to a place illuminated by an immensely bright light. A tremendous peace overcame me. My grandmother, who had died 9 years before, was there. I couldn't see her, she seemed behind me, but I could feel her presence and hear her voice. Suddenly, I was thrust back into my body. I don't know how or why. My next recollection is of the nurse standing near me in the recovery room. Glorious experience is rare, but not unique. Other people have reported very similar near-death experiences. In the book Life After Life, Raymond Moody summarized the experiences of over 50 people who went through extraordinary experiences when they were close to death. Many of these experiences corroborate the basic details of what Gloria G. experienced. These reports suggest the following argument. 1. Some people report that they had experiences while being outside their bodies. 2. The best explanation for these reports is that minds can indeed exist without bodies. Therefore, minds probably can exist independently from bodies. This is an inductive argument and therefore cannot establish its conclusion with absolute certainty. However, we need to determine how strongly this best explanation argument supports its conclusion. Remember what we learned in Chapter 2. In order to find out whether a given explanation is indeed the best, we need to compare the explanation to other available explanations of the same fact. How else can we explain the many accounts of near-death experiences? One possibility is that these experiences are caused by oxygen deprivation. We know that people whose brains have been deprived of oxygen frequently report having visions and unusual experiences. Another possibility is that these experiences are caused by anesthetic drugs like ketamine. Moreover, neurologists who recently studied the brain of a patient who had reported out-of-body experiences found that a part of the patient's brain known as the angular gyrus was very active during these experiences. This suggests that out-of-body experiences might be caused by neurological processes in the brain. It is therefore possible to explain near-death experiences without accepting the claim that minds have the ability to leave their physical bodies. These alternative neurological explanations have the advantage of being relatively simple since they refer only to physical entities, example, brains, neurological processes, angular gyrus, and avoid any reference to non-material minds. In addition, they appear to be more conservative, since many people find the idea that the world consists only of physical entities to be in agreement with their overall picture of the world. For this reason, most contemporary philosophers and scientists do not think that near-death experiences provide very good support for substance dualism. However, it should be pointed out that there is an ongoing debate about their status. Some philosophers go so far as to claim that near-death experiences and other paranormal psychological phenomena like telepathy and clairvoyance provide good reasons for accepting a dualistic solution to the mind-body problem. The fact that there is so much debate and disagreement suggests, however, that we cannot settle the mind-body problem with arguments that appeal to near-death experiences and other paranormal phenomena. It is prudent to look for alternative arguments for and against dualism. The conceivability argument. There are several alternative arguments in support of dualism, but we will focus on one very prominent one, the conceivability argument. To understand this argument clearly, we need to know more about what philosophers say about the relation X is identical to Y. Let us look at a hypothetical story. Suppose you have a conversation with Paul, who is a big fan of conspiracy theories. Among other things, Paul believes that George W. Bush is not really who he claims he is. Paul is convinced that George W. is actually the same person as Dan Quayle. According to Paul, Dan Quayle realized that he could never win the presidency as long as people recognized him as Dan Quayle, so he proceeded to pass himself off as the oldest son of his mentor, George Bush. According to Paul, the rest is history, for Dan Quayle, disguised as George W. Bush, reached his ultimate goal and became President of the United States. Paul's theory that George W. Bush and Dan Quayle are the same person is, of course, rather silly. But how can you refute him? The answer is pretty straightforward. A and B are identical to each other only if they have all properties in common. This principle is known as Leibniz law, and it plays an important role in many areas of philosophy. If you apply Leibniz law to Paul's theory, George W. and Dan Quayle can be identical to each other only if they have all properties in common. Suppose you find out that Dan Quayle is 5'9" tall, whereas George W. is 6'1". This is sufficient evidence to refute Paul's theory, for you have now shown that Dan Quayle has at least one property that George W. lacks. This fact, together with Leibniz law, establishes that Dan Quayle and George W. Bush cannot be the same person, and that Paul's conspiracy theory is false. The Quayle-Bush story illustrates a general argumentative strategy in support of substance dualism. If we can find at least one property of minds that bodies do not have, we are entitled to draw the conclusion that minds and bodies cannot be one and the same thing. This is the basic strategy of the conceivability argument, which was first introduced by René Descartes. In standard form, this argument appears as follows. 1. I can conceive that I exist without a body. 2. I cannot conceive that exist without a mind. Therefore, 3. My mind is more intimately connected to me than my body is, and thus my mind has a property, the property of being essentially connected to me, that my body lacks. 4. If my mind has at least one different property than my body has, then my mind cannot be identical to my body. Therefore, my mind is not identical to my body. At first glance, all premises of the conceivability argument appear to be true, and the argument therefore seems to make an impressive case for substance dualism. However, some philosophers have expressed reservations about it. First, consider premise 1. Can I really conceive that I exist without a body? If I have no body whatsoever, then I also have no eyes, and no ears, and no tongue. But how can I be myself without being able to smell, see, or hear? It is easy to imagine that I exist with a different body from the one I have right now. I could be 7 feet tall and weigh 400 pounds. But this is not enough for the argument to succeed, for I can equally well imagine that I exist with a different mind. So, in order to draw the necessary distinction between body and mind, I need to make sense of the idea that I can exist without anybody at all. Some thinkers have doubted that it is logically possible for a person to be identical to a disembodied being. The second problem with the conceivability argument is that the concept of conceivability is not sufficient to justify the conclusion that entities are not identical to one another. Consider the following, obviously flawed, argument. 1. I can conceive that Clark Kent is an ordinary human being. 2. I cannot conceive that Superman is an ordinary human being. Therefore, Clark Kent has a property that Superman lacks, and that entails by Leibniz law that Clark Kent is not the same person as Superman. This argument demonstrates that we need to be very careful when we apply Leibniz law to properties that are a result of our beliefs. There is a crucial difference between the sentences "the car in the yard is red" and "I believe the car in the yard is red." The latter sentence can be true even if the car in the yard is orange. Thus, conceiving of objects A and B as different does not warrant the conclusion that A and B are in fact different. Conceived differences might be caused by the fact that we describe A and B differently, and that these different descriptions cause us to have different beliefs about A and B. In other words, one and the same object, for example, the planet Venus, might be described into different ways, as evening star or morning star, and we therefore might have different beliefs about the same object if we encounter it under different descriptions. For instance, I might believe that the morning star is a planet, whereas I might believe that the evening star is an actual star. This reality suggests that our inability to conceive that we exist without our minds might reflect only that we describe minds and bodies differently. Therefore, the observation that we conceive of the relationship between ourselves and our bodies and minds differently is not strong enough to establish that minds and bodies are ontologically independent entities. Intentionality. Even though the conceivability argument fails, the general strategy of the argument is promising. The best arguments in defense of dualism rest on the attempt to find properties that distinguish minds from bodies. In the contemporary discussion, many philosophers focus their attention on intentionality, which is a technical philosophical term that refers to a property of mental states. Some mental states examples, the thought that I should buy a present for my mother, are about something else. In this case, the mental state is about my mother and the present I want to buy. To say that mental states have intentionality is to say that mental states represent something else. Notice, however, that it is not clear how ordinary physical objects like trees, cars, or brain states can be about other things in the same way that mental states are. A tree and any other physical object are what they are, and it is hard to see that they could represent something else. It would be strange to say that a tree is about my mother. This has prompted some philosophers to resurrect the general strategy of the conceivability argument in a different form. They argue that it is in principle impossible for physical states of the body to have intentionality. But since mental states do have this property, it seems to follow that bodies and minds are different kinds of entities. The debate about intentionality is still ongoing, with no clear resolution in sight. Arguments against substance dualism. We have seen that the arguments in defense of dualism are open to objections. When one fails to establish a philosophical position, it is always advisable to determine whether it would not be easier to disprove the theory instead of proving it. Let us turn our attention, therefore, to some of the more serious objections to dualism. The problem of interaction. Substance dualists like Descartes believe not only that minds and bodies are independent substances, but also that minds and bodies interact with each other. When you raise your arm up into the air, the physical movement of your body was probably preceded by a mental event, the decision to raise your arm. In situations like this, it seems natural to say that the mind caused the body to move. On the other hand, there are instances when your body seems to influence your mind. Suppose, for example, that you expose your body to 8 hours of intense sunlight. The chances are great that the resulting state of your body will lead to a considerable amount of pain sensation. In this case, a physical state, burned skin, has caused a mental state, sensation of pain. Once we realize that mind and body interact so closely with each other, we can also see that substance dualism faces a serious problem. Given that minds and bodies are different substances, how is it possible for them to influence each other? The following hypothetical situation might help you to understand this impasse more clearly. Suppose you are playing a game of pool with Joe Shark. Joe is more skilled than you, and he is already working on the 8 ball while you still have most of your balls on the table. Suddenly, Joe stops and puts down his cue. He closes his eyes and stands very still. At first, you think that Joe is simply concentrating before he attempts to sink the 8 ball, but after several minutes you become irritated and ask, "Hey Joe, what are you doing? You're supposed to take your shot." Joe responds, "I'm in the process of taking my shot. I have decided to sink this last ball with my mind. Just give me a couple of minutes to focus all of my mental energies on the ball." What would you say to Joe in this situation? Maybe, "Joe, you can stand there and think about sinking the 8 ball until you're blue in the face, but I can tell you one thing for sure, it's not going to go anywhere. In order to move the 8 ball, you need another physical object like a stick or a hand. Minds alone can't move matter." And if Joe does not accept your explanation, wouldn't you conclude that he has a rather bizarre sense of reality? This hypothetical story illustrates that substance dualism cannot explain how material bodies can causally interact with immaterial minds. The basic structure of the problem can be illustrated with the following reductio ad absurdum style argument. 1. Assume that substance dualism is true. 2. If substance dualism is true, then the mind is an immaterial, non-extended thinking substance, and the body is an extended physical substance. 3. Immaterial, non-extended substances cannot interact with extended physical substances. 4. Mind and body interact with each other. Therefore, substance dualism is false. This argument is valid, and all of its premises seem to be true. You might wonder on what grounds people accept premise 3. Can we be sure that immaterial and non-extended substances cannot causally interact with extended physical substances? In defense of this premise, we can point to a fundamental physical principle that physical energy is neither created nor destroyed, principle known as the conservation of energy. If we were to believe that non-physical events could cause physical entities to move, the total amount of energy in the universe would increase, and the principle of the conservation of energy would be violated. As long as we subscribe to the principle of the conservation of energy, premise 3 is well established. Some dualists, those who embrace a position known as parallelism, have tried to save their theory from this argument by denying premise 4. They claim that minds and bodies exist in parallel worlds and thus never interact with each other. But parallelism faces the difficult task of explaining why mental events and physical events, although disconnected, are so well coordinated with each other. Some thinkers have tried to explain this harmony by arguing that God intervenes and assures that mind and body are appropriately linked, a solution known as occasionalism. But it is easy to see that occasionalism is a rather convoluted theory that is in conflict with Occam's razor. Overall, there seems to exist no easy way for a dualist to escape the problem of interaction. A category mistake. The Oxford philosopher Gilbert Ryle, 1900 to 1976, developed a further objection to dualism. Ryle claimed that dualists put the term mind into the wrong logical category and thus commit a category mistake. To explain the logical framework of category mistakes, Ryle presented the following hypothetical situation. Suppose your parents come to visit you for the first time on campus. They are eager to see the university, so you take them on a little tour of the campus. You show them the library, the dorms, the lecture halls, and the auditorium. After the tour, you can see that your parents are disappointed, so you ask them why they are not enjoying themselves. They say, "We came here to see the university, but all you have shown us are the lecture halls, the dorms, and the library." That's great. But would you now please show us the university itself? Your parents have committed a semantic mistake. They think that the university is a specific building like the library or the dormitory. They do not realize that the term university refers to a whole group of buildings. Thus, they have put the term into the wrong logical category, a good example of a category mistake. According to Rull, substance dualists are guilty of committing a category mistake. Dualists classify minds as substances. They say, for instance, that minds can leave the body and that minds can cause the body to move. Dualists therefore attribute properties to minds that we normally attribute only to separately existing physical things. According to Rull, dualists fail to realize that the term mind does not refer to a specific entity like the body but rather refers to certain aspects of our bodies. Defenders of dualism can accuse Rull of simply begging the question. By insisting that minds should not be classified as substances, Rull seems to assume what he is trying to prove. However, Rull's criticism of dualism shows that it might be fruitful to think about the mind as something other than a non-physical substance. Food for thought. A good example to illustrate the ambiguity most philosophers feel about near-death experiences is given by the British philosopher A.J. Ayer, 1910 to 1989. 1 year before his death, Ayer, who had been an atheist and physicalist all his life, was in intensive care, and his heart stopped beating for 4 minutes. Upon awakening, he reported, "I was confronted by a red light, exceedingly bright, and also very painful, even when I was turned away from it. I was aware that the light was responsible for the government of the universe." After several days, Ayer drew the following conclusion from this experience: "My recent experiences have slightly weakened my conclusion that my death will be the end of me, though I continue to hope that it will be." What conclusion would you draw if you had undergone a similar near-death experience as A.J. Ayer? Food for thought. According to many religions, we can exist in heaven with a spiritual body. But this raises the question of what spiritual bodies would be like. Would all spiritual bodies look alike? Would there be a male spiritual body and a female spiritual body? Would my spiritual body be similar to the body I used to have when I was 18? Or would it be more like the body I will have when I am 75? How would you answer these questions? Food for thought. We have seen that substance dualism is in conflict with the fundamental principle of physical science, the conservation of energy. However, not everybody would agree that this is a devastating objection to dualism. Some people believe that phenomena exist that are not explainable by the common physical laws of matter and energy. One such possible phenomenon is telekinesis, the ability to move objects from a distance with one's mind. What do you think about telekinesis? Do you think we should take seriously reports from people who claim that they can move physical objects from a distance? Recall the movie Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker uses the Force to pull a spaceship out of the swamp. Do we have any reasons to think that this might be causally possible in our universe? Food for thought. Category mistakes occur not only in the context of the mind-body problem but also in many other fields. Take a look at the following claims and explain why they, too, might entail a category mistake. 1. The world spirit helped Napoleon to conquer Europe. 2. Nothingness stared into his eyes and made him jump from the bridge. 3. The American Revolution was caused by the Enlightenment. 4. The average American lives next door. 5. Love is my best friend. Varieties of physicalism. 6.4 Explain the philosophical position of physicalism. The basic tenet of physicalist theories about the mind is the idea that we can explain mental states in terms of physical states of the body. This idea is especially attractive in light of recent advances in neuroscience. We know, for example, that injuries to the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex affect language capabilities in most people. We further know that chemicals like cocaine, alcohol, or anesthetics can affect our emotions and thoughts. Moreover, we have learned that memory loss can be caused by the degeneration of nerve tissues in the brain. All of these findings suggest that our mental life is dependent on physical processes within our bodies, especially in the brain. To develop a satisfactory physicalistic theory of the mind, however, we need to do more than simply state the fact that our minds are dependent on our bodies. In addition, we need to say precisely what kind of physical states constitute mental states like pain or the feeling of love. At this point, thinkers who are attracted to physicalism begin to disagree and develop different kinds of physicalistic theories about the mind. The following chart provides an overview of some basic physicalistic theories. In order to determine whether physicalism is a plausible solution to the mind-body problem, we need to see whether any of these theories provide a satisfactory account of the relationship between body and mind. Behaviorism. 6.5 Summarize the objections to behaviorism. Behaviorism is closely tied to the development of psychology, which is not a very old scientific discipline. It was only at the start of the 20th century that psychology gradually established itself as an independent scientific field of study. The main challenge for psychology was to develop a satisfactory scientific methodology with which to study the human mind. Every science relies heavily on observations and measurements. However, it is far from easy to observe and measure what happens in the minds of human beings. At first, psychologists tried to solve this problem by asking subjects to report on their sensations, feelings, or thoughts in experimental situations. But the results of this approach were disappointing. Psychologists found out that many people have a hard time reporting reliably what happens in their minds. For example, suppose Susan is a psychologist who wants to study pain. Among other things, she wants to develop a classification of different types of pain. To this end, she creates experimental settings that should help her to determine whether experiences of type X are more painful than experiences of type Y. She starts her investigation with a relatively ordinary experiment. She wants to investigate whether it is more painful to pierce one's nose or one's navel. Now suppose that you participate in Susan's study and that, under her supervision, you pierce your nose as well as your navel. After the procedures, Susan asks you to compare your pain experiences. It certainly would be challenging for you to report with a high degree of confidence that one pain sensation was more intense than the other. It is not easy to compare sensations. But even if you were sure that piercing your navel was more painful than piercing your nose, it would not follow that this would be true for other subjects as well. Introspective reports about sensations and mental content are idiosyncratic and cannot generate or support general laws about the human mind. After realizing that introspective reports did not lead to a secure scientific foundation for psychology, psychologists started to look for other ways to study the mind. The solution was to study human behavior. How can human behavior tell us anything about human minds? Consider the following examples. Suppose I want to find out whether your belief in God is stronger today than it was last year. To find the answer to this question, I could simply ask you. However, we have already seen that this approach leads to certain methodological difficulties, and you yourself might not know whether the degree of your belief has increased or decreased. A better way to find an answer to this question might be to simply study how you behave. If you used to go to church weekly and read the Bible every evening but now you go to church only occasionally and have stopped reading the Bible, it is quite reasonable to conclude that your belief in God has decreased. Studying your behavior, going to church, reading the Bible, talking about God, is an excellent way to gain knowledge about your mind, the degree to which you believe in God. Logical behaviorism. Observing behavior as a way of studying the mind is known as methodological behaviorism, the cornerstone of a scientific study of the mind. Methodological behaviorism proved to be pretty successful and thus caused several philosophers to push the behavioristic approach to the mind even further. They developed so-called logical behaviorism, which was most prominently defended by B. F. Skinner, 1904 to 1990. The key idea is that we can eliminate all mental terms like pain, belief, and hope from our scientific discourse by translating these terms into claims about human behavior. Consider the sentence "John loves Lucy." According to Skinner and other logical behaviorists, this sentence should not be part of good scientific language since we cannot determine clearly under what conditions this sentence is true or false. In order to make progress, we first need to translate the sentence into a statement about John's behavior. We should say something like John has a tendency to bring flowers to Lucy, to hug her repeatedly, and to tell her "love you." This sentence about John's behavior can be verified as true or false and thus can be an acceptable part of scientific discourse. In general, logical behaviorists suggest that all mental phenomena like beliefs or sensations can be understood as dispositions to behave in certain ways. Logical behaviorism is therefore an eliminative theory about mental terms because it holds that all terms like pain or belief can be replaced by descriptions that refer only to behavior. Logical behaviorism is a rather economical theory of the mind. It solves the mind-body problem by explaining minds in terms of behavior. Consequently, it does not face the problem of interaction, which creates such severe problems for dualistic thinkers. For logical behaviorists, our talk about minds is just a convoluted way to talk about our behavior. Because minds are not fundamental entities in the world, the question of how minds can interact with bodies is thus eliminated. Logical behaviorism also provides a theoretical framework for psychological research. Since human behavior can be understood in terms of stimuli, conditioning, and responses, behaviorism allows us to learn about the mind by constructing theories centered upon these observable terms. According to behaviorism, our mental life is simply a set of learned behavioral responses to various stimuli and reinforcements from our environment. Arguments against logical behaviorism. In spite of its elegance and simplicity, logical behaviorism is open to some serious objections. One fundamental problem can be illustrated with a hypothetical story. Suppose Julie's best friend Sarah arranges a blind date for Julie with Sarah's old love, Bill. Sarah is convinced that Julie and Bill will be a perfect fit. However, when Julie meets Bill for the first time in person, she can see right away that Bill is the date from hell. He is boring, ill-mannered, and simply ugly. But since she does not want to hurt Sarah's feelings, Julie pretends to have a good time with Bill. She laughs at his dull jokes and pretends to take an interest in his life stories, even as she is dreading every minute of this first and last date with Bill. Now suppose that Bill is a behaviorist. What would Bill say about Julie's feelings for him? He feels entitled to say that Julie likes him because she displayed all the necessary liking behavior. However, Bill has been fundamentally wrong about Julie's mental state. Her real feelings did not correspond to her behavior at all. This is not a knockdown argument against behaviorism, since a behaviorist can claim that Julie would have acted differently if the circumstances had been different, i.e., if she had not wanted to pretend to like Bill for the sake of her friend Sarah. A behaviorist might still maintain that Julie had a disposition to display non-liking behavior toward Bill. She simply chose not to act on this disposition. The story nevertheless illustrates two weaknesses of logical behaviorism. First, to explain why Julie chose not to display her non-liking behavior toward Bill, one must refer to the fact that she believed this behavior would hurt the feelings of her friend Sarah. A behaviorist, however, cannot refer to mental states and must therefore offer an inadequate and incomplete explanation of why she displayed liking behavior toward Bill. Second, the story illustrates that displaying a certain type of behavior is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for being in a certain mental state. Mental states seem to be the cause of behaviors, but they are not the same things as behavior or dispositions to behave. The linguist Noam Chomsky developed a further objection to logical behaviorism. According to logical behaviorism, it is possible to explain our future behaviors, and thus our minds, in terms of past conditioning and responses. Behaviorists believe that there are lawful connections between our past behavioral experiences and our dispositions to behave in certain ways in the future. However, this explanatory model makes it impossible to explain why we sometimes display completely novel verbal behaviors. When we speak or write, we sometimes express propositions that nobody, to our knowledge, has uttered before. Right now, for example, I am writing a sentence that I have probably never written or read before. The most natural explanation for my behavior is that I have certain ideas in my mind that I want to express. But a behaviorist cannot make use of this explanation, because mental states are not supposed to play any role in explaining our behavior. Thus, logical behaviorism cannot explain how people manage to display novel, linguistic behavior. Although there are further objections to logical behaviorism, we can already see that an exclusively behavioristic theory of the mind is too restrictive. Logical behaviorism draws attention to the fact that our behavior is closely linked to what happens in our minds, and that the study of behavior can help us to develop a scientific theory of the mind. However, it is problematic to reduce all mental states to dispositions to behave in certain ways. If we want to develop a satisfactory physicalist theory of the mind, a complete account of our mental life will involve more than talk about our behavior. Food for thought. Consider one more time the research project of Susan the psychologist. Would she be able to find an answer to the question of whether piercing one's navel is more painful than piercing one's nose if she were to study behavior rather than rely on introspective reports? What do you think? Food for thought. How would the logical behaviorist transform the following sentences so that they become a legitimate part of scientific discourse? 1. Henry is angry with Maud. 2. Torsten believes that he is ugly. 3. Nikisha wants to become rich. 4. Tonya is in severe pain. 5. Avrindan has learned Spanish well. Food for thought. If you understand logical behaviorism clearly, you should be able to understand why the following joke is funny. After having sex, one logical behaviorist says to the other, "It was good for you. How was it for me?" The identity theory. 6.6 Describe the strengths and weaknesses of the identity theory. Behaviorism is not a very natural theory about the mind and mental phenomena. Few people would think that their mental life can be reduced to talk about behavior. The identity theory, on the other hand, is a very intuitive theory that seems immediately plausible. The basic thrust of this theory can be illustrated by a historical example. In 1848, in a small town in Vermont, the railroad worker Phineas Gage was seriously injured while setting a charge of dynamite. The explosion was set off early and sent a steel bar right through his head. Surprisingly, Phineas Gage survived the accident and recovered from his head injuries. However, the accident caused serious repercussions. After Phineas Gage had recovered from his injuries, his behavior changed dramatically. Whereas he used to be easygoing and polite, he became obnoxious and ill-mannered. Friends who knew Phineas Gage before the accident claimed that the accident had turned him into a different person. How can we explain what happened to Phineas Gage? According to the identity theory, the answer is simple and straightforward. Although Phineas Gage's body survived the accident, his brain was significantly altered by the steel bar. If we assume that mind and brain are the same thing, we can explain Phineas Gage's change in behavior without problems. We can claim that the steel bar injured not only Phineas Gage's brain but his mind as well. The general claim that mental states are ultimately brain states is the central thesis of the identity theory. This theory is well supported by recent advances in neuroscience, which have discovered that much of our mental functioning can be associated with specific parts of the brain. For example, identity theorists have no problem explaining that damage to the posterior sectors of the left brain hemisphere is associated with impaired reading, writing, and speaking abilities. They also have no problem explaining why persons who suffer strokes in the right cortex experience difficulty with three-dimensional thinking or pattern recognition. If the mind and brain are identical to each other, we should expect damage to particular parts of the brain to correspond to damage of specific mental functions. Moreover, the identity theory provides a fruitful framework for neuroscientific research. If the mind and brain are the same thing, we can understand all mental phenomena as a physical, chemical reaction of neurons. My thought that my grandmother is a sweet old lady is perhaps nothing else but the firing of neuron. Hush 27,883 to neuron hush 30, 152. Feelings of depression or schizophrenia might be nothing else but chemical imbalances in the brain. The task of neuroscience is to identify which type of physical chemical reaction corresponds to which type of mental state. Arguments against the identity theory. In spite of its attractiveness, the identity theory is open to objections. One crucial objection is well illustrated by the philosopher John Searle. Imagine that your brain starts to deteriorate in such a way that you are slowly going blind. Imagine that the desperate doctors, anxious to alleviate your condition, try any method to restore your vision. As a last resort, they try plugging silicon chips into your visual cortex. Imagine that to your amazement, and it turns out that the silicon chips restore your vision to its normal state. Now, imagine further that your brain, depressingly, continues to deteriorate and the doctors continue to implant more silicon chips. You can see where the thought experiment is going already. In the end, we imagine that your brain is entirely replaced by silicon chips, that as you shake your head, you can hear the chips rattling around inside your skull. In such a situation there would be various possibilities. One logical possibility, not to be excluded on any a priori grounds alone, is surely this: you continue to have all of the sorts of thoughts, experiences, memories, etc. that you had previously. The sequence of your mental life remains unaffected. Searle's thought experiment points to a crucial weakness of the identity theory. It identifies mental states with brain states, and thus is committed to the general claim that wherever there is no brain, there is no mind. But is this claim really plausible? The thought experiment shows that it is logically possible that a being whose brain has been replaced by silicon chips has a mind. Thus, a strong version of the identity theory, sometimes called type identity theory, according to which mental states and brain states are necessarily identical, would be false. The identity theory leads to a certain kind of chauvinism by insisting that beings without the appropriate hardware, i.e., brain states, cannot have a mental life. This seems problematic in light of the fact that lower animals, for example, an octopus, seem perfectly capable of experiencing mental states like pain without having a brain similar to ours. It also appears problematic in light of the possibility that advanced machines or space aliens might have minds. Suppose, for example, that we encounter an alien space creature that is made entirely of previously unknown materials. We certainly would not be entitled to conclude that it does not have a mind simply because it does not have a brain like ours. Although our own mental life seems intimately tied to our brains, the general claim that mental states are brain states appears suspect. This conclusion does not mean that we have to abandon the identity theory completely, but it does mean that we have to modify the theory to make room for the fact that other creatures besides humans could have minds. Food for thought. A good way to test whether you understand competing philosophical theories is to apply the theories to the same situation and try to determine why they lead to different explanations or predictions. Let us try this with behaviorism and the identity theory. Consider the following situation. Suppose that you are going through a difficult time in your life. Each evening after you go to bed, you start thinking that your life is simply meaningless and empty. You are tired of having these thoughts and decide that you want to change your mind. You want to get rid of these depressing late-night thoughts. 1. Suppose behaviorism is true. How would a behaviorist try to change his mind in this situation? 2. Suppose the identity theory is true. How would an identity theorist go about changing her mind? Functionalism. 6.7 Explain the advantages and limitations of functionalism. Functionalism developed as a response to the central weakness of the identity theory. Functionalists take seriously the idea that minds can be realized in different physical materials. They thus reject the idea that minds are necessarily tied to brains. According to functionalism, mental states are functional states. But what exactly does this mean? Functional concepts and stuff concepts. If someone were to ask you to explain the nature of water, you would probably say that water is a certain kind of substance. More precisely, you might want to say that water is H20. Water is a stuff concept, that is, it can be defined as a particular kind of material stuff. Gold and wood are further examples of stuff concepts. Now, consider the term money. To clarify what money is, it is not very helpful to say something about silver or printed paper. Money can come in a wide variety of different material manifestations. A credit card, for example, is a form of money. To clarify what money is, we need to make reference to the functional role that money plays in our lives. We might say that everything that allows us to purchase goods is money. This functional definition of money would apply to silver coins as well as to credit cards or paper money. The term money therefore does not refer to a stuff concept, but rather to a functional concept. Functionalism, mind as software. The basic idea of functionalism is to treat the mind as a functional concept. We can roughly say that according to functionalism, something is a mind if it functions appropriately. This explains why space aliens or advanced machines might have a mind although they do not have a brain. As long as an entity possesses a physical mechanism that can play the same functional role as our neurons play in our brain, that entity has a mind. It does not matter whether the entity consists of organic tissue, silicon chips, or glass fibers. Functionalism is therefore well positioned to deal with the chauvinism that created so many problems for the identity theory. An analogy might be useful to illustrate the basic tenet of functionalism. According to functionalism, the mind is similar to a software program, which can run on very different computers as long as the hardware of the computers is complex enough to run the program. Similarly, a functionalist believes that any physical system that is complex enough to recreate the functional interactions among neurons in our brain can have a mind. Functionalism and artificial intelligence, the Turing test. Functionalism clearly supports the idea that it should be possible to create artificial intelligence, AI. If we succeed in building machines that can play the same functional role as our brains, these machines must, according to functionalism, have a mind. Alan Turing, 1912 to 1953, one of the founders of modern computer science, suggested a method to determine whether advanced machines indeed have minds. The basic idea of the Turing test is to put a human being, whom we will call the tester, in front of a computer terminal. The tester can type questions about any subject matter into the computer terminal, and the questions are answered by somebody in another room. What the tester does not know is whether the questions are answered by another human being or by an advanced machine. It is the job of the tester to determine whether he is interacting with a machine or with a real human being. Alan Turing suggested that if we could create a machine that could answer the questions of the tester such that the tester is convinced that he is dealing with a human being, then we could conclude that the machine has a mind. In this case, we would say that the machine has passed the Turing test. Supporters of functionalism should accept the Turing test. Being able to conduct a conversation is, after all, one of the crucial functions of minds. Since functionalists agree that anything that plays the appropriate functional role is a mind, they must also accept the idea that a machine that passes the Turing test has a mind. Functionalism therefore supports the idea that artificial intelligence is possible. Arguments against functionalism. The Chinese room argument. A number of thinkers have objected to the idea that machines could have minds simply by virtue of enacting the appropriate functional program. John Searle is perhaps the best-known philosopher who has attacked functionalism on this point. To refute functionalism and the related idea of artificial intelligence, Searle presented the Chinese room argument. Consider a language you don't understand. In my case, I do not understand Chinese. To me, Chinese writing looks like so many meaningless squiggles. Now suppose I am placed in a room containing baskets full of Chinese symbols. Suppose also that I am given a rule book in English for matching Chinese symbols with other Chinese symbols. The rules identify the symbols entirely by their shapes and do not require that I understand any of them. The rules might say such things as, take a squiggle squiggle sign from basket number 1 and put it next to a squoggle squoggle sign from basket number 2. Imagine that people outside the room who understand Chinese hand in small bunches of symbols, and that in response I manipulate the symbols according to the rule book and hand back more small bunches of symbols. Now, the rule book is the computer program. The people who wrote it are programmers and I am the computer. The baskets full of symbols are the database, the small bunches that are handed into me are questions, and the bunches I then hand out are answers. Now, suppose that the rule book is written in such a way that my answers to the questions are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. For example, the people outside might hand me some symbols that unknown to me mean, "What's your favorite color?" And I might, after going through the rules, give back symbols that, also unknown to me, mean my favorite is blue, but I also like green a lot. I satisfy the Turing test for understanding Chinese. All the same, I am totally ignorant of Chinese. And there is no way I could come to understand Chinese in the system as described, since there is no way that I can learn the meanings of any of the symbols. Like a computer, I manipulate symbols, but I attach no meaning to the symbols. Searle's Chinese room argument is intended to show that computers are, in principle, not capable of understanding the meanings, semantics, of words and symbols. Computers are limited to processing symbols on the basis of their shapes, syntax. Genuine minds, on the other hand, are capable of understanding the meanings of words. Searle concludes therefore that computers only appear as if they have minds. In reality, they do not. Passing the Turing test is not a sufficient condition for having mental states. Defenders of functionalism and artificial intelligence are normally not impressed by the Chinese room argument and point to several weaknesses. First, Searle's argument is built around an analogy between the Chinese room and the inner workings of computers. This analogy might not be as close as Searle makes it out to be. Currently, computers process information in a sequential, step-by-step manner that is roughly analogous to what happens in the Chinese room. But current computers also cannot pass the Turing test. Perhaps computers that actually pass the Turing test might function differently from the manner that Searle describes. Computers that pass the Turing test might, for example, be based on parallel distributive processing rather than sequential processors. Thus, the central analogy between computers and the Chinese room might be misleading. The second objection to the Chinese room argument is called the system's reply. The Chinese room argument shows that the person in the room does not understand Chinese. The person, however, is only one part of the system. What would happen if we were to consider the system as a whole? Could the system as a whole understand Chinese? Consider the workings of my brain for a moment. It is quite plausible to think that no one part of my brain understands the meaning of English sentences. Instead, understanding and consciousness might be a result of my whole brain working together. Perhaps Searle is overlooking the possibility that the whole Chinese room together is capable of understanding Chinese. Searle himself has responded to these objections at considerable length. At this point, it would be too much to explore the debate about the Chinese room argument in full. For our purposes, it is sufficient to note that the Chinese room argument is by no means a knockdown argument against functionalism. However, if you agree with John Searle and believe that even the most advanced computers cannot have minds, it might be interesting to explore how the Chinese room argument can be strengthened. Problems with qualia. A more serious objection to functionalism is raised by so-called inverted spectrum cases. Consider two twin brothers, Al and Tony, who experience the same colors differently. Tony sees red and green as normal people experience these colors. Alf, on the other hand, experiences red as Tony experiences green, and green as Tony experiences red. However, neither Tony nor Alf, nor anybody else, for that matter, will ever discover that they have different sensations with respect to the same color. When Tony sees a ripe tomato, he will say, "Look at that great red tomato." And Alf, who has learned to associate his experience of green with the word red, will say the same thing. Alf is perfectly capable of picking out red things. It is just that what people call red causes a green sensation in him, and what people call green causes a red sensation in him. This thought experiment raises a fundamental problem for functionalism from a functional perspective. Alf and Tony appear to be equivalent. They can do the same things, example, recognize green and red, and they display the same verbal behavior in similar circumstances. So according to functionalism, both are in the same mental state when they see and experience red things. This, however, is clearly not the case, for Alf and Tony experience the same color differently and thus have different color sensations. Inverted spectrum cases show that functionalism has a difficult time making room for what philosophers have called qualia, which refers to the phenomenal aspect of mental states. The philosopher Frank Jackson gives the following examples of qualia: the itchiness of itches, pangs of jealousy, the characteristic experience of tasting a lemon, smelling a rose. It is hard to deny that some of our mental states, especially sensations, have a characteristic phenomenal feeling, i.e., qualia, when we experience them. When I smell freshly brewed coffee, run my fingers over sandpaper, or see bright red, I am the subject of mental states with distinctive phenomenal characteristics. But it is problematic to explain qualia in functional terms, because it seems possible that functionally equivalent mental states are associated with completely different subjective qualia. The philosopher David Chalmers puts it this way. Nobody knows why physical brain processes are accompanied by conscious experiences at all. Why is it that when our brains process light of a certain wavelength, we have an experience of deep purple? Why do we have any experiences at all? Could not an unconscious automation have performed the same task just as well? Chalmers argues that it is logically possible that there are beings who act like us in every respect and who process information as we do but who lack any kind of subjective consciousness, and hence any qualia. Chalmers calls these beings zombies, not to be confused with Hollywood zombies. Since Chalmers's zombies are functionally equivalent to us, they do and say the same things that we do, but lack subjective phenomenal qualia. They seem to illustrate that functional accounts of the mind are incomplete. Philosophers have called this quandary the problem of the explanatory gap. Frank Jackson wrote in this context, "Tell me everything physical there is to tell about what is going on in a living brain, the kind of states, their functional role, their relation to what goes on at other times and in other brains, and so on and so forth, and be I as clever as can be in fitting it all together. You won't have told me about the hurtfulness of pains, the itchiness of itches, pangs of jealousy, or about the characteristic experience of tasting a lemon, smelling a rose, hearing a loud noise or seeing the sky." It seems as if functionalism, perhaps any purely physicalistic theory of the mind, does not provide a complete account of what minds really are. Food for thought. Determine whether the following concepts are MUF concepts or functional concepts. 1. Food. 2. Lion. 3. Pen. 4. Uranium. 5. Shoes. Food for thought. The question of whether advanced computers can have minds is a hot philosophical issue. One cannot deny that computers have come a long way and that they are capable of astounding things. But is it also possible that computers might someday develop consciousness and a sense of self-identity? Many people are convinced that this could never happen. They believe that no machine could ever have a mind. However, not all of their supporting arguments are very convincing. Take a look at the following arguments and decide whether or not they are compelling. 1. Computers are not alive. Only living things can have a mind. Therefore, computers cannot have minds. 2. Computers only follow programs and thus do not act creatively or in unpredictable ways. In order to have a mind, one needs to be able to act creatively and unpredictably. Therefore, computers cannot have minds. 3. Computers cannot have feelings and emotions. A thing without emotions and feelings cannot have a mind. Therefore, computers cannot have minds. Food for thought. Are Chalmers' zombies really logically possible? Some philosophers have doubted the coherence of the idea that there could be beings that do all the things we do without having any feelings at all. Consider specific activities in your life and decide whether a zombie could participate in these activities without any subjective feelings. Eliminative materialism. 6.8 Explain the key ideas behind eliminative materialism. Since functionalism is facing some serious difficulties, it is tempting to look for alternatives. One alternative physicalist theory is eliminative materialism, which has been advocated by, among others, contemporary American philosophers Patricia and Paul Churchland. Eliminative materialists suggest that we abandon the attempt to incorporate mental states into our picture of the world. They hold that mental states are not part of a scientific and accurate view of the world. Eliminative materialists claim that mental states do not really exist, they are nothing but convenient illusions. At first glance, this sounds outrageous, but much can be said in defense of this position. In order to get a better understanding of eliminative materialism, consider the following scenarios. Suppose that early one morning you walk on the beach and watch the sunrise. You mumble to yourself, "Oh my God, the sun is rising spectacularly. I had forgotten how beautiful that is." These sentences make perfect sense, even though the first sentence is literally false. The sun does not actually rise at all, it only looks to us as if the sun is rising. In reality, there is no rising sun but only the earth in motion. Consider another example. Suppose it is 15th April and you are in the process of filling out your tax return. In order to make things easier, you have bought a computer income tax program. Unfortunately, your computer has difficulty with the new program and is crashing frequently. Shortly before midnight, you cry out in desperation, "I think my computer is mad at me. It doesn't want me to fill out my tax forms on time." Again, this sentence makes perfect sense, although it is not literally true. It might seem as if your computer has desires and intentions, but it does not really care about the fact that you are having problems. Nonetheless, we find it quite natural to talk as if computers have intentions and desires. Consider one further example. Suppose you observe an octopus emitting a black inky substance. In this situation, it is natural to say, the octopus believes that a predator is close by and therefore emits the inky substance in order to become harder for the predator to spot. Although it is natural for us to speak as if octopuses have beliefs and desires, we would not be surprised to find out that in reality octopuses do not have beliefs and desires at all. There is a biological, chemical process in the octopus that can be fully explained and understood without any reference to beliefs and desires. Once we understand that we talk naturally as if other creatures and entities have minds even though they do not really have any mental states, the possibility arises that the same might be true for us as well. It certainly seems to us as if we have a rich array of mental states, and we certainly talk as if we have these mental states, but eliminative materialists maintain that this is an illusion caused by our habits of speech. In reality, they say, there are no beliefs, desires, or wishes, but only neurons, synapses, and neurotransmitters. Thus, eliminative materialism rids us of all the traditional puzzles of the mind-body problem. If we accept eliminative materialism, there is no difficulty in explaining how the mind is related to the body. If the mind does not exist, all we have are the neurological processes in the brain, which will eventually, as science progresses, be understood in greater and greater detail. Nothing more is required to bury the mind-body problem once and for all. This is an elegant and radical solution to the mind-body problem. However, it is easy to see challenges to eliminative materialism. First, Some might find it impossible to accept the idea that minds and mental states are illusions. We might follow Descartes and argue that given our own thinking experiences, our own minds must necessarily exist, and we can know that this is so. Of course, an advocate of eliminative materialism will not be impressed by this line of reasoning and will dismiss these Cartesian thoughts as powerful illusions. However, it does not seem clear to me that if eliminative materialism and Cartesian intuitions clash with each other, then reason requires us to abandon Descartes. It is just as, if not more, tempting to abandon eliminative materialism. Second, we might point out that eliminative materialism seems to be self-refuting. If it is true that nobody believes anything, since minds do not really exist, then how are we to believe that eliminative materialism is true? Does not any philosophical argument presuppose that we have beliefs and a mental life? Final remarks on the mind-body problem. 6.9 Summarize the arguments of the various theories of the mind. The relationship between body and mind is today as mysterious as it was in the past. From a common-sense perspective, Descartes' substance dualism seems very attractive. It is supported by religious beliefs and near-death experiences, but it leads to a number of prominent difficulties, the problem of interaction, and Rawls' charge of a category mistake. Physicalist theories about the mind are attractive in light of recent advances in neuroscience. We have seen, however, that a purely behaviorist approach to the mind cannot produce a satisfactory theory. The identity theory is more promising, but it too leads to a central problem, the possibility that mental states can be realized in multiple physical systems. Functionalism is well suited to deal with this difficulty, but it has a hard time accounting for the subjective, qualitative character, qualia, of mental states. It is not quite clear yet how serious the qualia problem really is. Some contemporary philosophers simply deny that inverted spectrum cases or Chalmers zombies raise fundamental problems for physicalistic theories of the mind. They argue that these cases do not present genuine logical possibilities. Others have taken the qualia problem as a reason to reintroduce eliminative materialism or a version of dualism, property dualism, which is a mixture of physicalism and dualism. Property dualists reject substance dualism and agree with the physicalists that our minds have a purely physical foundation. However, property dualists deny that every mental property can be reduced to physical processes. This puts property dualists in a position to accept qualia as irreducible mental properties. Whether property dualism is a fruitful theory is not yet quite clear. Philosophy of mind is one of the most active fields in contemporary philosophy. Our present discussion is only a preliminary introduction to the main positions and questions. However, the discussion should have given you a chance to think about the relationship between body and mind on your own. In the course of reading this chapter, you may have revised some of your own ideas about how bodies and minds are related to each other. It might be interesting now for you to go back to the food for thought exercise on page 99 and see whether you would answer the questions there differently. Study and reflection questions. 1. It seems pretty clear that higher developed animals like dolphins or elephants also have some sort of mind. However, it is much less clear whether chickens have minds. What do you think? Do chickens have minds? Which mind-body theory would you use to defend your answer? 2. Are you more attracted to physicalism or dualism? Develop reasons in defense of your choice. 3. Will computers be able to develop self-consciousness? Defend your answer in light of various theories about the mind-body relationship. 4. Many people report near-death experiences. What significance, if any, do these experiences have for our understanding of the mind-body relationship? 5. We speak of Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, which we know do not exist. Is it also possible, as eliminative materialism claims, that there are no beliefs, hopes, or desires, in short, that there are no real mental states? What do you think?